I love doing things like that, writing down goals, thinking through exactly what's important to me. Um, having clarity around the things that we want, that's obviously a good first step, but it's hard to always live in that important category. Would you agree? Um, like anything, once we're aware of it, uh, that's always a good place to start. Um, but for a moment, let's consider some of the things that get in the way of those goals. Some of the things that we tell ourselves are number one, I don't have time. Now, that we know what we want and we have clarity, that doesn't mean that suddenly there's these gaps of time that open up for it. You have the same amount of time yesterday as you'll have today. There's literally 1,000 books on this concept of time management. First things first, the one thing, essentialism, the 4-hour work week, the subtle art of not giving a fuck, and 100 others. They all basically say the same thing. You gotta batch your time better. The thing that's killing us is not the fact that we have things that are urgent and aren't important. It's the way that we spread them out throughout the day. The fact that we transition so much from one thing to the other. It's not the act of checking emails, it's the fact that we don't do it in one batch chunk. Now, I believe that in the 21st century, we're transitioning into a better system where we don't have to be with people face to face. That means that we have the ability to make our schedule on our own terms. There's a concept I just learned. There's two ways that we can allocate our time. One as a manager and one as a maker. Now, a manager is how we typically do it, where we live from appointment to appointment, team meeting this hour, meet with the client, coffee this hour. And that's just something that we assume is how work is supposed to be done. But there's another concept, this maker concept, or how a writer would work, or how a computer programmer would work, is that they realize that the task at hand is going to take a much longer time period, at a bare minimum half a day. And so instead of assuming that they'll check emails and have coffee and be on a phone call and also do work at the computer, they'll do just one thing, and that's typically devote themselves to that one activity. Everything else is unplugged. I'm thinking through this a lot for myself about how I may not be able to create time, but I can be a lot more clever in how I go about things. And I also find that I'm not a very good multitasker. As it turns out, none of us are. And if you say you are, well, you haven't done the research. It's actually impossible to be a multitasker. So there's something to think about. A couple other thoughts or things that get in the way of our goals is that your dream may just be too big. A lot of times when we sit down and we write what it is that we want, we shoot for the moon. But it turns out the way that we actually accomplish anything that's audacious is usually to break it down into bite-sized chunks. So we could say, man, I want to run a marathon. And I would say, well, how much have you run? And you'd be like, none. I've run 400. Or you could say, man, I want to lose 50 pounds. Like, okay, well, how much weight have you lost ever in your life? Like 1 pound. And if I'm just counseling you through those ambitions, I would say, well, let's keep those on the horizon, but let's make it something that isn't so overwhelming as we're trying to accomplish it. So for the marathon, let's go set a goal to run a really shitty 5K next month. For the 50 pounds, let's set a goal to lose 2 pounds this next month. And when you hear that, it's not quite as heroic, but that's the point. In your brain, it needs to be something that immediately is actionable and it's easy to do. So sometimes we have a hard time making steps towards these goals because our brain just knows, like, man, this is too overwhelming of a concept to undertake. Lastly, other people can get in the way of our personal goals. Sadly, when we choose to be ambitious people ourselves, people will often not understand. They won't see the value, and even worse, they might try to interfere. This is true. This has a lot to do with their own sense of control. It has a lot to do with you breaking out of what they currently understand about you. There's some what they call cognitive dissonance, where now their mental model is in disarray. And so a lot of things that's happening there is really their own issue. And so what do you do here? You could leave them in the dust, which may be a solution, but oftentimes it's not. If this is a coworker or if it's a family member, you can't just drop them like a bad habit. Now, another option is you could sit them down and really try to explain it. And that's probably a really good idea if it's somebody that you live with, if it is somebody you're related to, for them to seek to understand what it is that you're going for here, to have their support. But probably the most realistic thing that we can do is just be about our own business. What I mean by that is that your task is yourself. That's your life's task, is making yourself better. It's not their task. And so again, we need the courage to be disliked as far as our personal goals go as well. One of my favorite things to say in that context is fuck them. Now, easier said than done, right? A lot easier to say, hey, I don't care what you think, than to actually live that. But luckily for you, that is going to be the focus of what this next skill and superpower will be for the next couple of days. Until tomorrow.